I still remember the exact shade of the wallpaper in that hotel ballroom. Ivory and gold. Expensive. The kind of wallpaper that exists to remind you of everything you're not. My husband Gerald told me to stand near it. Specifically near it, not by the bar, not near the windows, not anywhere people might look at me and wonder who I was. Near the wallpaper. So I would blend in. "Your dress is fine," he said in the car on the way over. Which was Gerald's version of a compliment. What he meant was, "It won't embarrass me too badly." What he meant was, "Stay small tonight. Diane. Stay invisible. This matters." This always mattered. His career always mattered. His reputation always mattered. His impression on the right people always mattered. I had stopped mattering somewhere around year 4 of our marriage, if I'm honest, and I'd stopped being honest about that somewhere around year 6. My name is Diane Calloway. I'm 54 years old. I have a master's degree in urban planning that I never used. A talent for watercolor painting that Gerald called a hobby. And 22 years of marriage to a man who introduced me at parties as my wife, without ever following it with my name. That night was the Meridian Group Acquisition Gala. Gerald's firm had just been absorbed by a larger company, and the new ownership was hosting this event to assess the people they'd inherited along with the contracts and the office furniture. Gerald had been terrified for weeks. Not that he would ever admit it to me, but I knew the signs. The late phone calls, the way he stopped eating dinner, the fact that he suddenly, inexplicably, wanted me to come. In 22 years of marriage, Gerald Calloway had never once asked me to accompany him to a professional event and actually meant it. I was decorative, proof that he was a stable family man with a suitable wife. The kind of accessory that communicated trustworthiness to other men in expensive suits. I found the dress at a consignment shop 3 days before the event. Dusty rose with a modest neckline. Floor length. Clearly someone else's gown from a nicer occasion than anything in my recent life. The tag said it had come from a boutique in Aspen. I paid $60 for it and told myself it looked fine. Gerald looked at it the way you look at a stain on a good tablecloth. Noticeable, unfortunate, something to be managed. "Just don't draw attention to yourself," he said as we walked through the hotel entrance. "Let me do the talking. If someone speaks to you, keep it brief, and don't mention my degree." I finished for him. Or my family, or the paintings. "I know, Gerald." He didn't even look embarrassed that I knew the script by heart. He just nodded and walked ahead of me into the ballroom. The Meridian Group Gala was everything those events always were. Crystal everywhere, women in gowns that cost more than my monthly allowance. Men laughing too loudly at each other's jokes while calculating exactly how useful each person in the room might be to them. I found my spot near the decorative arrangement of white orchids and ivory wallpaper. I accepted a glass of water from a passing server. I watched Gerald work the room with the desperate energy of a man who knows the ground beneath him is unstable. And I thought about how many years I had stood in corners of rooms exactly like this one. Holding glasses of water I didn't want. Wearing dresses that were fine. Waiting for Gerald to decide we could leave. I had been 17 minutes into this familiar ritual when the room changed. It didn't announce itself. Rooms don't, but you can feel the shift in air pressure when someone important enters, the way conversations slow and heads turn without people quite meaning to turn them. I looked toward the main entrance out of habit. And the world stopped. The man walking through those double doors was in his late 50s. Tall, with dark hair silvered at the temples and the kind of ease in his movements that you can't perform. You either have it or you don't. He wore his tuxedo the way people wear clothing they've forgotten they're wearing. But it wasn't any of that which stopped my breath. It was his face. The angle of his jaw. The way he held his head just slightly tilted to the left when he was scanning a room. The way he always had when he was thinking carefully about something. Nathan Reeves. I hadn't said his name out loud in 30 years. Had barely allowed myself to think it. Had spent decades carefully building walls around the part of my memory that belonged to him. The way you wall off a room in an old house because the ceiling has collapsed and you can't bear to look at the damage. The murmur near me was immediate. That's him. That's the new CEO. Someone said, Nathan Reeves. He built Reeves Capital from nothing. The man is worth a fortune. Nathan Reeves, who had been 26 years old the last time I saw him. Nathan Reeves, who had asked me to marry him in a rainstorm outside the apartment building where I used to live in Portland, Oregon, his dark hair soaked through, laughing and completely serious at the same time. Nathan Reeves, who I had left without explanation and never contacted again. Across the ballroom, Gerald had already spotted the new CEO and was pushing his way through the crowd with the single-minded focus of a man whose entire future was narrowing to a single handshake. I pressed myself backward toward the orchids, my heart hammering. He wouldn't see me. The room was crowded, the lighting was atmospheric and dim, and I was near the wallpaper, just like Gerald had wanted. But then, Nathan accepted Gerald's handshake, nodded politely at whatever Gerald was saying, and then his eyes moved past Gerald's shoulder the way a searchlight moves. Methodical, patient, looking for something specific. And they found me. The entire ballroom seemed to go quiet. Though it didn't, it only went quiet inside my own chest. Nathan Reeves stared at me from across a crowded room in the way that people only stare when they are certain they are not mistaken. His face went very still. Then something broke open in it. Quietly, the way ice breaks on a river in early spring. Not dramatically, just inevitably. He said something brief to Gerald. I couldn't hear what, and began walking toward me. Gerald's head turned to follow his line of sight and I watched the exact moment my husband understood where Nathan was going. I watched the confusion, then the alarm, then something uglier than either. Nathan stopped in front of me. Up close, he was older in all the ways 30 years will make a person older. Deeper lines around his eyes. A gravity in his expression that the boy I had known hadn't had yet. But his eyes were the same. That particular shade of dark brown that always made me think of old wood and warmth and someone who was genuinely paying attention to you. Diane, he said. Just my name. The way you say something you've been waiting a long time to say and aren't certain yet if the saying of it will be a relief or a wound. Nathan, I whispered back. He reached out and took both my hands in his. His hands were warm, steadier than mine. I've been looking for you, he said, his voice low enough that it was meant for me alone. For a very long time. He paused, then, as if making a decision he had made once before and was making again with complete intention. I never stopped. Diane, I need you to know that. I never stopped. The sound of Gerald's champagne glass hitting the marble floor rang through the ballroom like a gunshot. What followed was the kind of scene that lives in your memory in fragments. Gerald's voice, sharp and humiliated, insisting this was a misunderstanding. Nathan's quiet refusal to look away from my face. The sensation of 30 years folding in on themselves like paper. All those carefully constructed walls going soft and then dissolving entirely. We're leaving, Gerald said, gripping my elbow the way he gripped things he considered his property. Right now. Nathan watched Gerald's hand on my arm. His jaw tightened with something controlled and precise. Call me, he said, pressing a card into my free hand. His eyes met mine with absolute certainty. Whatever happens after tonight, call me. Gerald dragged me out of that ballroom past 200 witnesses. I clutched Nathan's business card in my palm the entire way, the sharp edges biting into my fingers like something that was trying to wake me up. I had been asleep for 22 years. And I was finally, terrifyingly, beginning to wake up. Let me tell you about Nathan Reeves. Let me tell you about who he was before the tuxedo and the quiet power and the 30 years of absence. I met him when I was 24 years old, in the graduate program at the University of Oregon. He was in the business school. I was in urban planning. We shared a seminar on sustainable development and argued about density housing policy for 3 weeks before either of us admitted we were actually enjoying it. Nathan was different from the men I had known. He listened without waiting for his turn to talk. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things, small things, that people mentioned in passing and brought them up later in ways that made you feel like you had been genuinely heard. He was also, and I understood this later rather than then, a man who loved very quietly and very permanently. Not the kind of love that arrives with great declarations and dramatic gestures. The kind that simply stays. That builds things slowly and carefully and refuses to abandon what it has built. We dated for 2 years. 2 years of coffee shops and long walks and the kind of conversations that make you feel like every previous conversation in your life was just warm-up. He met my parents and brought my mother flowers without being told that she liked them. He read my thesis drafts and gave actual feedback. Careful and honest. The kind that made the work better. The night he proposed, it was raining. We had just come out of a terrible movie that we both pretended to enjoy and then immediately confessed we hated. We were standing under a broken awning, laughing at the rain, and Nathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been carrying it for weeks waiting for exactly the right moment. "I've been trying to figure out the perfect time to do this," he said. "I've realized there is no perfect time. There's just now, and I'm done waiting." The ring was simple. A single round diamond on a plain gold band. He knew I didn't like elaborate things. He knew that because he paid attention. I said yes immediately. And I meant it with everything I had. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my mother was already sick. The diagnosis came 3 weeks after our engagement. Breast cancer. Stage 3. Caught late because my mother had been quietly ignoring symptoms for months in the way women of her generation sometimes did. Not wanting to be a burden. Not wanting to be the one who made things difficult. The treatment would be extensive. Expensive. My parents had modest savings and no supplemental insurance. Nathan's response was immediate and uncomplicated. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "We can move your parents closer to us. We can help with the costs." He meant it. I never doubted that he meant it. But my father had a different response. My father, Robert Holloway, was a man of absolute and unyielding pride. He had spent his entire adult life providing for his family without help from anyone. And the idea of accepting financial support from his daughter's fiancé was not something he could accommodate in his understanding of himself. He came to see me alone one evening while Nathan was at a study group. He sat at my kitchen table and he told me. In the quiet way he said the things that were hardest for him. That he needed me to come home. Not permanently. Just during the treatment. Just while your mother needs someone. Just until we know what we're dealing with. He didn't say, "Leave Nathan." He didn't have to. Because the way my father asked for help, the only way he knew how, was to make it impossible to say no without feeling like you were choosing yourself over the people who needed you most. I made a decision that I would spend 30 years questioning. I gave Nathan back his ring. I told him that I wasn't ready. That I needed time I couldn't promise him. That he deserved someone who could commit to a future without conditions and complications that might never resolve. I told him all of this in the rational, measured language of someone who has decided to excise a part of themselves and is determined to do it cleanly so it doesn't hurt anyone more than necessary. What I did not tell him. My mother was dying and my father was asking me to come home and I could not figure out how to be both the woman Nathan needed me to be and the daughter my father was counting on. What I did not tell him. I was terrified that if I asked Nathan to wait, I would be asking him to build his life around an uncertainty that might last years. And I loved him too much to do that to him. Nathan did not accept my explanation. He asked me, carefully and directly, what was actually wrong. He said he could see I was in pain and he needed me to trust him with whatever it was. And I looked at his face. This man who loved me quietly and permanently. And I lied to him. I told him it wasn't working. That I had realized we wanted different things. That I was sorry. The look on his face is the thing I cannot describe accurately even now. Not anger. Not accusations. Something quieter and more damaging than either. The look of a person who has been told that what they believed was solid ground was actually nothing at all. He left that evening without raising his voice. That was Nathan. Even in the worst moment. He was careful with other people. I heard through mutual friends that he had tried to reach me several times in the months after. I didn't respond. My mother's treatment had begun and I was sleeping on my parents' couch and trying to hold the three of us together with willpower and cooking and the kind of daily presence that doesn't leave room for your own grief. I told myself I would reach out when things stabilized. Things never fully stabilized. My mother went into remission after 14 months. Then relapsed 2 years later. The second treatment was harder than the first. By the time she finally recovered, genuinely recovered, strongly enough that I could allow myself to believe in it, I had been away from Portland for 3 years. Nathan had moved to San Francisco. The life we had imagined together had been replaced by the one I had actually lived. I met Gerald Calloway at my cousin's wedding when I was 29 years old. He was handsome in a conventional way and relentlessly confident, and he pursued me with the focused energy of a man who was accustomed to acquiring things he decided he wanted. After 3 years of caretaking and grief and the particular loneliness of a life lived entirely in service of someone else's survival, Gerald's attention felt like rescue. I confused being chosen for being loved. I confused his certainty for the real thing. We were married 8 months after we met. My mother attended in a green dress she had bought specifically for the occasion and cried with a happiness that I accepted as validation of a decision I was never fully certain about. The first year was fine. The second year, I started to notice the pattern. The small corrections, the way I dressed, the way I spoke in public, the opinions I volunteered at dinner parties that Gerald would smooth over with a laugh and a gentle redirect. By year 5, the corrections had become expectations. By year 10, the expectations had become the architecture of our entire marriage. Gerald did not shout. He did not leave marks. He simply made the cost of disagreement high enough and consistent enough that I stopped disagreeing. I thought about Nathan sometimes. I won't pretend I didn't. In quiet moments, early mornings before Gerald woke up, late evenings in the studio he had eventually allowed me for my painting, I would think about who I had been when I was 24 years old arguing about density housing policy with a man who actually listened. I had kept his ring. I know that sounds strange, but the night I gave it back to him I had been so certain I was doing the right thing that I hadn't let myself say a real goodbye. Somewhere in the back of my jewelry box, wrapped in a piece of blue velvet, the simple diamond band had traveled with me through every move and every year of a marriage that had nothing to do with love. The morning after the gala, Gerald left early for what he described as damage control meetings. His voice was controlled in the way it got when he was managing rage that he would express later. In private, when there were no witnesses. I waited until I heard his car leave the driveway. Then I sat at the kitchen table with Nathan's business card in front of me and my cold coffee and the particular stillness of a house that has never felt like home. His personal number was written on the back in precise, even handwriting. The same handwriting I remembered from the margin notes he used to leave in my thesis drafts. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the second ring. "Diane. How did you know it was me?" "I've had this number for 1 day," he said. "You're the only person I gave it to." We met at a small French cafe near Millennium Park, Chicago in October. The kind of morning where the sky is that particular gray that feels more like texture than color and the trees along the street are full of gold and amber that hasn't quite let go yet. Nathan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees he had ordered because he remembered how I took mine. Black with 1 sugar. 30 years and he still remembered. We sat across from each other in the particular silence of two people who have said enormous things to each other and are now navigating the distance between those things and ordinary conversation. "Tell me what happened," he said finally. "The real story, not what you told me then." So I did. I told him about my mother's diagnosis, about my father's pride and the way he had asked for help in the only language he had, about the impossible geometry of loving a parent who needed you and loving a man who deserved better than an indefinite uncertainty. I told him about the 14 months of treatment and the relapse and the years that accumulated while I was focused entirely on survival. Theirs and mine. About meeting Gerald in the wreckage of all of that and confusing relief with love. Nathan listened without interrupting. He had always been that kind of listener. The kind that made you feel like your words were landing somewhere that would hold them carefully. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You were trying to protect me," he said finally. "I thought I was," I said. "I thought if I asked you to wait, you'd wait, and I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know if it would ever end. And you had a whole life that deserved to happen." "Diane." His voice was very gentle. "I would have waited. You needed to know that I would have waited." "I know that now," I said. "I think I knew it then, too, which is why I didn't ask. Because I knew you'd say yes. And I couldn't live with what that would cost you." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. The same gesture from the night before. In that ballroom, when the whole room was watching. Now, in this quiet corner cafe with no audience and nothing at stake except the truth. It meant more. "I looked for you," he said quietly. "For years, I knew something wasn't right about the way you ended things. I kept thinking that if I could just find you and ask you directly, face to face, you would tell me what had actually happened." He paused. "Your trail went cold very effectively." Something in the way he said it, the particular precision of effectively, made me go still. "What do you mean, effectively?" Nathan looked at me carefully. "Gerald Calloway was a junior associate at a real estate firm in Portland when you left the city. He had access to information and contacts that would have been useful for someone who wanted to make a woman difficult to locate." The cafe went very quiet around me. "You think Gerald?" "I think Gerald Calloway identified an opportunity and removed the competition," Nathan said, his voice measured and precise. "I can't prove it entirely. But my investigators found a pattern of interference that goes back to the early months after you left Portland. Redirected searches, false forwarding addresses, professional references that described you as relocated out of the country." I thought about the year I had spent at my parents' house during my mother's first treatment. My father, so proud, so certain that what I was doing was right. Gerald, who had appeared at my cousin's wedding at precisely the moment when I was most vulnerable, most exhausted, most susceptible to someone who offered certainty instead of complication. Gerald, who had never once mentioned in 22 years of marriage that he had any connection to Portland, Oregon to that period of my life. "How long have you known this?" I asked. "I had suspicions for about a decade," Nathan said. "Confirmation came 3 months ago. Which is when I arranged to acquire Meridian Group." He paused. "Their Chicago office was the only confirmed location where you'd been consistently reached by my investigators. So yes, the acquisition was motivated partly by business and partly by the fact that I needed a reason to be in the same room as your husband." I absorbed this information the way you absorb a significant shock, slowly. With a strange clarity, the pieces assembling themselves into a picture that explained 30 years of a life that had never quite made sense. Gerald Calloway had not stumbled into my life. He had engineered his way into it, had kept Nathan at a distance with the kind of careful, invisible manipulation that left no fingerprints. Had spent 22 years benefiting from the absence of the one person who might have made me brave enough to leave. "What do I do?" I asked, though I was already beginning to know. "That depends entirely on what you want," Nathan said. He turned my hand over in his. studying my fingers with the focused attention I remembered from his thesis feedback. From the way he used to look at problems he was committed to solving. But Diane, whatever you decide, I need you to know that finding you wasn't about the past. It wasn't about recovering something that's gone. He looked up. You are not the 24-year-old I asked to marry me. And I'm not the 26-year-old who asked. Whatever this is, if it's anything, it starts now. It starts from who we actually are. I drove home that afternoon with Nathan's words arranged carefully inside me like objects I was trying to determine the value of. Gerald was in the kitchen when I walked in. His expression told me everything. He had been waiting. He had been thinking. He had decided on his strategy. We need to talk about last night, he said. About what you think you're doing. I know about Portland, I said. Gerald's face did something complex. Then it settled back into the controlled surface expression I had been watching for 22 years. I don't know what he told you, Gerald said carefully. He didn't tell me anything I couldn't have figured out on my own. I said, if I had ever been allowed to figure anything out on my own. What followed was the conversation that ends marriages. Not loudly. Gerald never did anything loudly. But with the quiet systematic efficiency of a man dismantling his own arguments. Because when you ask the right questions calmly enough, the architecture of 22 years of management reveals itself without any drama at all. He had known about Nathan's search from the beginning. He had used his early connections in Portland real estate to redirect the investigators' inquiries. He had cultivated my exhaustion and my grief and my father's pride. He had offered himself at precisely the right moment, knowing that I was too depleted to look closely at his reasons. I built this marriage, Gerald said finally, and I could hear beneath his controlled voice something that might have been, in another man, genuine feeling. I built our life. Everything you have is yours. I finished. You're right. Everything here is yours. I figured that out a long time ago. I just couldn't figure out what to do about it without anything of my own. I called Nathan from a hotel parking lot 20 minutes later. I'm leaving him, I said. I want to take that position you mentioned. The community development consultancy. He had offered it the night before. Advisory work on the urban planning initiatives his company was funding in the city. Real work. My work. Work that had a salary attached to it that I had never imagined earning. I'll make sure everything is in place before you start, Nathan said. And Diane, are you safe tonight? I will be, I said, and for the first time in a very long time. I meant it. The divorce proceedings began the following month. Gerald's lawyers were thorough and expensive and committed to the principle that I had no financial claim on any asset that Gerald had technically acquired before our marriage or through business decisions I had not been party to. Which was all of them. Because I had not been permitted to be party to any of them. Nathan's lawyers were more thorough. And significantly more expensive. What they uncovered over the following weeks painted a picture that Gerald's careful self-presentation had concealed for decades. Financial irregularities in his development projects. A pattern of property transactions that had attracted quiet attention from the city's financial oversight department. Evidence that several investment partnerships had been structured in ways that benefited Gerald at the direct expense of his partners. None of it sent Gerald to prison. He was too careful for that. But it was enough, more than enough, to guarantee that his lawyers stopped fighting quite so aggressively over the settlement terms. I walked out of our marriage with my car, my paintings, my clothes, and enough financial settlement to establish myself independently in a city I had lived in for 15 years without ever truly belonging to it. The day I moved into my own apartment, Nathan helped me carry boxes. He did not make a declaration about what it meant that he was there. He did not reference our history or the 30 years or any of the enormous weight of what had led us to this ordinary afternoon of carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs in a building on the north side of the city. He just helped me carry things. And when we finished and I stood in the middle of my empty living room looking at my life assembled in cardboard boxes around me, He ordered pizza and sat on the floor and said, "Tell me what you want this place to feel like." That was Nathan Reeves. Even in the most significant moments, he focused on the practical next thing that would make you feel better. We took it slowly. Whatever it was between us, we did not treat it as a continuation of something we had been forced to pause. We started over. Carefully and honestly, two people in their 50s who knew enough about themselves by now to do it right. We had coffee twice a week while my divorce finalized. We went to concerts and galleries and had the long conversations about ideas that I had been having alone in my head for 22 years because Gerald found them tedious. Nathan still argued about urban planning policy, still asked follow-up questions, still remembered small things and brought them up later in ways that made me feel genuinely heard. He proposed again on a Tuesday in April. No rain this time. We were in my apartment, on my sofa, reading separate books in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer need to fill every moment with talk. Nathan put his book down, reached into his jacket pocket, which he was wearing inside because he ran cold, which I had recently learned about him, and produced a small box. "I still have your ring," he said. I kept it, which I realize may seem strange. He opened the box. The same simple diamond band. The same plain gold that caught the lamplight exactly the way I remembered. "I want to ask you properly this time. No rain, no urgency, just the actual question, with all the time in the world to answer it." I looked at the ring for a long moment. Then I looked at Nathan. This man who had loved me quietly and permanently for 30 years without being given a reason to and without being given the chance to stop. "Yes," I said. "Still, yes." We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside the city. 40 people we actually loved. Food we had chosen together after 3 rounds of tasting because Nathan approached weddings with the same methodical investment he brought to business acquisitions. And I had spent so many years not being consulted about anything that being consulted about everything felt like the deepest form of generosity. My mother, still in good health, wore a blue dress and cried in the way she had been crying at my significant life events for 30 years. She held both my hands before the ceremony and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "He looks at you the way your father looks at me." That was the moment I understood what I had almost lost forever and had somehow, improbably, been given back. I want to tell you something about second chances before I go. They don't feel the way the stories say they will. They don't feel like being 24 again. They don't erase the years in between or make you who you were before everything happened. What they feel like, if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to take them, is this. They feel like arriving somewhere you've been traveling toward for a very long time. And sitting down, and realizing that the journey was the thing that made you ready for where you finally landed. Nathan and I have been married for 3 years now. I run the urban planning consultancy that his company funds, working with city agencies on affordable housing initiatives and community development projects. It is, finally, the work I trained for 30 years ago. It is the life I almost didn't get to have. On our first anniversary, Nathan had my old thesis framed. The actual document, margin notes and all, including his corrections in that precise even handwriting I had remembered for 30 years. He hung it in my office at the consultancy with a small plaque underneath that read simply, "Where it started." I think about Gerald sometimes. He is rebuilding, in the way that men like Gerald always rebuild, methodically and without apparent self-reflection. I bear him no specific ill will. What he did was calculated and cowardly, and it cost both Nathan and me 30 years of a life we deserved. But he also could not have kept us apart if we had been braver about fighting for each other at the beginning. The person I am angry at, if anger is even the right word, is the younger version of myself. The 26-year-old who decided that love was something you had to earn the right to pursue by first eliminating all your inconvenient complications. The woman who confused sacrifice with love and control with safety and could not imagine asking for help from the person who had specifically promised to give it. If I could go back to that apartment in Portland, to that evening with the broken awning and the rain and the man who was carrying a small box in his coat pocket and waiting for the right moment, I would tell her, ask him. Tell him the truth. Let him decide what he can carry. That is what love is actually for. But I can't go back. None of us can. What I can do, what I do, every morning when I wake up beside Nathan Reeves in the life we are building together now, carefully and honestly and with full knowledge of everything it took to get here, is choose it again. Choose it deliberately, with open eyes, knowing what we risked and what we lost and what we somehow, improbably, managed to find our way back to. Some things, it turns out, are permanent even when everything else feels temporary. Some love is patient enough to wait 30 years for a second chance. And some people are worth every single year of the waiting. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me what you would have done differently. Tell me if you believe in second chances. And stay on the screen. I have 2 more stories waiting for you that I think you'll love just as much. Thank you for watching until the very end.